Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back for this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. According to our guest today, Jayson Georges, honor and shame is the primary operating system for 80% of the world's population. We'll spend some time explaining how honor and shame culture compares to our Western guilt-innocent culture, and then offer some practical helps on how to relate to people from an honor-shame culture. Before we get to that interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Your profession, your skills, your passions. It's you making disciples of the nations. Crossworld desires to help you engage the world's least reached marketplaces in the ways God has gifted you. To learn more about Crossworld and their global opportunities, we invite you to visit crossworld.org today. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to this episode and this interview of the Global Missions Podcast. Our guest today is Jayson Georges. For those of us that are not familiar with Jayson, he is the founding editor and primary blogger of honorshame.com. And here I'll just mention quickly that we do take show notes during these interviews, and so you'll find all of the references, whether it's a book or a website like honorshame.com or some other resource that Jayson mentions, that will all be found in the show notes. You can find that on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. Jayson and his family have served in Central Asia for an extended period of time. They've been involved in disciple making and church planting and in micro-enterprise development. And his current role is missiologist in residence at an evangelical mission agency. He focuses on developing resources and training through practical workshops. Jayson, welcome to the program.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Really looking forward to this interview and to learning together with you. Jayson has written a book called Ministering in Honor-Shame Cultures. So, Jayson, I wonder if you'd begin just by telling us a bit about why you wrote this book and why it's relevant to global missions today.
Yeah. Well, I think my story is probably a typical story of an American missionary in terms of I became a believer here in America, went to a great seminary and learned lots of good things. And then our family went to Central Asia, a country that's a Muslim country. So we learned lots about Islam. But then we got there and we realized that people really they weren't Muslims, essentially. Of course, in name they're Muslims, but on a day-to-day basis, it really wasn't Islam that framed everyday life, but it was these notions of honor and shame. And we kept bumping up against honor and shame in so many different ways, in our evangelism or relationships with neighbors or, the businesses, the microenterprise businesses that we were developing there in the context, and just began to see how honor and shame was really the main values. People were always trying to project a sense of honor and cover a sense of their shame. And for us as Westerners, those were quite foreign. So we made lots of cultural mistakes. And then in the process, we're trying to figure out as a team, okay, how do we communicate the gospel in this context? And how do we really disciple people to live out the gospel in this honor-shame culture? So I joke that the book is essentially, it's 9 years of mistakes packed into 250 pages. And so hopefully others don't have to make those same mistakes.
That's good.
They can understand honor and shame a little before going out.
That's great. Well, we appreciate the opportunity to learn from what you have learned already and for your generosity with that. I'd like to start with some definitions, actually, so that we can understand a little better what we mean by honor and shame.
Yeah.
Let's start with honor. When you say honor, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you kind of get at a good point here in the sense, of course, all the listeners know what that word honor means, but it's a really hard word to define, in part because it's an invisible thing. You can't point to something and say that is honor.
Right.
And so it's a cultural construct. It exists only within the context of a group of people. So honor is essentially when the community considers you important. It's esteem, it's respect, it's a good name, a good reputation. And because other people think positively of you, they want you to be included in the group. So ultimately, honor comes from relationships and connections and a sense of belonging within the group.
Okay, so esteem and respect. If we go to the other side then, what about shame?
Yeah, shame's kind of the inverse of that. Shame comes when the community rejects you. So shame is both a personal emotion, on the inside, a person feels unworthy or deficient, but it's also a negative evaluation by other people. They reject you, you're diminished, you're disgraced. And, there's lots of different ways that a culture can express that. One common way is the language of face. So even in English, we say, you lose face, or you're trying to save face, or you're trying to gain face. That's kind of, those are, synonyms that get at this idea of honor and shame. So one thing to realize is we talk about honor and shame in all these different ways. I'll give you two quick examples from America. Make America Great Again or Black Lives Matter are two things that really touch on honor and shame, but might not use the actual words honor and shame.
Well, it's something that relates to our culture, I guess, but maybe is not mainstream or the usual way we talk about it. If you create a contrast between North American culture and an honor and shame culture, how could we summarize the basic differences?
Yeah, the way it's been kind of categorized is the majority world is honor and shame, and Western countries like Europe and North America are going to be guilt and innocence. And so the difference between a guilt culture and a shame culture is this. In a guilt culture, it's much more individualistic, and kind of morality or social sanctions are governed by laws and rules. People are expected to follow, right and wrong according to their own conscience prompts them to do that. So it's much more individualistic. Whereas in a shame-based culture, it's not rules and laws that govern a sense of morality, but it's relationships, and especially maintaining harmony and maintaining the honor of your group, whether it be your family or your tribe or your nation, is what's the moral imperative. And so honor-shame cultures are much more collectivistic compared to the individualistic or guilt-based cultures of the West.
I think it's helpful to get our minds around that. It seems to me that it's not, perhaps like our Western culture wouldn't be 100% one or the other, but there are going to be elements of both of these things in both types of culture, but they're further out to the poles. Could I say it that way?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, it's not like these are two distinct categories and you're one or the other. You're right. They are the ends of an spectrum, and every culture will have both. But the main question is, which one's the dominant factor within it? And so you think about these honor-shame dynamics, kind of the group commitment plays out in many subcultures here in America. The most common one is, remember back our days in junior high. Those were really influenced by honor-shame dynamics, or the military, or rural communities, or even immigrant communities, say Asian Americans or Asian Canadians. All these are kind of subcultures that bring an honor-shame flavor into kind of the mainstream American culture, and it impacts it.
Okay, well, this is helpful to get our minds around this and to sensitize us to it, because as we've noted in other discussions about culture, mission workers will tend to take their own culture with them, assumptions and underlying ideas about how culture works. And unless we reconsider those, we can just take those with us and assume that our new people group where we're serving would think like we do.
Yeah, for sure. Let me give you one kind of concrete example of how this plays out, because I know I've been explaining things a little bit abstractly or theoretically. So this plays out in terms of communication in a really concrete way. In an honor-shame culture, the hardest word for people to say is no. that's considered very, direct, rude, and considerate. And so they often have very creative ways of declining your invitation. So I learned in Central Asia, if I invited someone to my house for tea, and if they said yes, that meant yes. But if they said, oh, of course, that would be great. That's wonderful. I would love to be there. I can't wait. That probably meant no. And so ironically, the more they said yes, the more they meant no. Now, as a Westerner, that sort of indirect communication seems immoral. And we even have phrases in English. We say, cut to the chase. Don't beat around the bush, get to the point. And so when we hear someone communicate indirectly, we think that they're lying, they're deceitful, they're rude, they're manipulative. We make assumptions about their heart or their moral integrity based on how they communicate. But what's interesting is the reason why they communicate like that isn't to lie, as we would assume, but it's actually to give us honor and to maintain harmony in the relationship. Because for them, preserving the relationship is the most important thing. And even if they can't make it to tea later, well, they'll just call, a little bit later and apologize for that and can't figure it out. I remember one time I understood that idea, but I was listening to an Afghan immigrant to Canada, and she said she invited a Canadian, an Anglo-Canadian, over to her house, and the Canadian person goes, "Oh yeah, that would be good. Let me look at my calendar." And for the Afghan person, she said, that was the rudest thing I've ever heard. Because in my culture, you're supposed to say, oh, yes, that would be great. Regardless of what's on your calendar, you have to preserve the relationship first, and you have to affirm the importance of the other person. And so on the flip side, when us Westerners kind of cut to the chase or speak really directly, it comes across as being kind of insulting or rude in honor shame cultures, as if we're trying to make them lose face or we are dishonoring them. So you can see how these two different cultures start really playing out in concrete ways in terms of communication.
Yeah. And what a great example, because, just thinking of myself working in North America, if I have a busy calendar and I say to someone, I'd like to look at my calendar and see where we can make this work, that's actually trying to accommodate and to bring a conversation together. I mean that to be a positive thing, and that could be interpreted otherwise by someone from an honor shame culture. Mm-hmm. Fascinating, and so important for us, because unfortunately here we're talking about good intentions that could be misinterpreted, right?
For sure. Yeah, and it's always good intentions. That just get misinterpreted, because what happens is there's the surface level events in terms of how we communicate or how we use time or how we use, how we serve food. But then every culture is going to use their own paradigm to interpret the meaning of those actions. So if you're using a guilt-based morality to interpret other people's actions, you tend to come away with a more negative impression of what's going on in their heart, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And vice versa. They misinterpret our actions as well.
Well, I'd like to ask some practical questions, but just before we get there, one more on the on the theological line. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the Bible's view about honor and shame and sin, and how these cultures think about those two concepts.
Well, it might be hard to answer that question because you want to talk about a little bit, but there's actually a lot about honor and shame in the Bible. And it's really surprising. This is probably the most common response I get from people, who, when I do a workshop, is they just say they're reading their Bible entirely different now. They're seeing things that they've never seen before, and how honor and shame is everywhere. Let me give you some examples of this. A great verse, if you want to learn one about this, is 1 Peter 2:7. It says, whoever believes in Jesus will not be put to shame, but honor for those who believe. And I feel like that really captures up this core essence of what biblical salvation is. It's God taking away our shame, the false shame that we so often bear, and restoring our honor, giving us a new honorable identity within his family. So that's 1 Peter 2:7. And there's many verses that talk about it. There's actually twice as many verses about shame as there is about guilt. And beyond the actual verses themselves, what's interesting is so many stories in the Bible communicate this concept that God is working to remove our shame and to restore our honor. And so often Western readers assume that the main point of biblical stories is simply to show how God forgives sins, which is true. That's definitely present in the Bible. But there's many stories that talk about how God removes our shame and restores our honor. And you think about the stories of Daniel or Esther or Joseph in the Bible, or the book of Ruth. It's this picture of God who is going out of his way, who is so gracious to those who have a lower status, and he's restoring their status, and he's exalting them to a position of honor. That way, God's glory and God's blessings can be shared to the other nations through his honored people.
Right. Wow. This is so important. And I like the idea that there are actually shame, honor elements in our culture too, but perhaps we have migrated or slid an emphasis over to the guilt side, to the exclusion, maybe even the unhealthy exclusion, even in our own culture, of honor and shame elements. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And if you want to dig deeper into that, we'll encourage you toward Jayson's book, Ministering in Honor-Shame Cultures. I'd like to get to some practical ideas as well, Jayson. And of course, many of our listeners will not live in honor-shame cultures, would be more inclined to guilt cultures.
Yeah.
But we have increasing numbers of new friends coming from other parts of the world who may well be from shame-honor cultures. I wonder what advice you would have for our listeners as far as general interactions with these folks and how we might approach relationships with someone from an honor-shame culture. What advice do you have for us?
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of my context. Our family moved from Central Asia to the Atlanta, Georgia area in the U.S., and we actually live in a refugee community here. And so, that's been our primary ministry context. And I think for people in that sort of context, for listeners, the number one advice that I give to people is simply eat with people. And so food is so important and so symbolic. It's how community and it's how relationships are formed. So you can invite people over to your house and have them be hospitable. But then also, as you are invited over to other people, enjoy the opportunity to be a guest in their home. And related to this idea of eating with people is exchange gifts with people. So if you have a new neighbor, say living in your apartment complex or in your neighborhood, take them over some sort of gift to welcome them in. It might just be as simple as something for the house or a basket of fruit. In many cultures is really, a common appreciated gift. And immediately they will understand what that means. They will understand that you want to have a relationship with them. That sort of exchange forges and really cements the relationship that you have with people. And so it's really around gifts and around food that honor-shame cultures form their relationships. And so, that would be kind of a great step one to have with people. And sadly, and kind of unfortunately, most people who come most immigrants to the West rarely enter the home of a Western person, and so hospitality is not really a distinguishing feature of Western culture, at least for America, where I live.
Wow, it's very simple, very practical, and again, I would think even for someone in our culture, near culture for North Americans, to be hospitable toward someone new moving into the neighborhood is going to be appreciated. Taking over a gift or a welcome gift, welcome to the neighborhood sort of thing. How much more for someone who has arrived from a faraway place or faraway culture, more cultural distance, how valuable that would be. I wonder, when we think about doing ministry and thinking evangelism and possibly discipleship, with the idea of discipling someone towards Christ and introducing them to this, what advice do you have for those that would like to be very intentional?
Yeah. Well, in terms of evangelism, in our book, Ministering in Honor-Shame Cultures, we have 2 chapters that talk about evangelism and just the ways it plays out in such different ways in an honor-shame culture. And so let me give you kind of a broad framework for understanding evangelism. In most Western contexts, how we communicate the gospel tends to be through a legal framework. If I asked you what is the gospel, you'd probably give me lots of words from a courtroom scene, judicial words: law, forgiveness, guilt, punishment, transgression, so on and so forth. Those sort of metaphorical images for explaining the gospel, explaining sin and salvation, resonate in a Western context where guilt and laws and rules are primary in morality. But in non-Western cultures and honor-shame cultures, morality is defined much more by community and relationships. And so one thing you can do in sharing the gospel to help people understand the problem of sin and the solution of salvation is to use relational language, or to use language from a community. So for example, in terms of sin, I always hear in the Chinese language, there's no such word for sin. The common word for sin is crime. And, a Chinese unbeliever will say, well, I'm not a criminal, therefore I'm not a sinner. But then I heard about a lady in the, Northwest of America. She is doing ministry among Chinese immigrants. And she realized in Chinese, there's a phrase called to scratch someone's face, which means to really insult them or to dishonor them and to break the relationship. And she was saying in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve scratched God's face. Well, immediately the Chinese knew exactly what that meant and the severity of their sin. And so this also happens. God does this in Ezekiel chapter 16. God uses really what would be the word, unpleasant language to describe Israel's sin to them in Ezekiel 16. He essentially says, you're being adulterers and you're being a bunch of whores. And so God uses the most shameful, the most shameful image within society, a prostitute, to explain to Israel how their sin was bringing shame upon them, but how it was also dishonoring God. But then, of course, that's not the end of the story. Salvation comes about as we are restored back into God's family, and he welcomes him back in. And so often the New Testament portrays salvation as inclusion back into God's group, or inclusion into God's family, this idea of reincorporation or adoption into God's family. So in terms of evangelism, we could be more aware of using relational or family language.
Boy, very helpful. Well, we've talked a little bit about evangelism and introducing some of these dear folks to the gospel. Would you comment just a little bit on the discipleship path and your advice for those of us that are coming from or our ordinary culture, our home culture, is a guilt culture, but we want to be discipling those in an honor-shame culture?
Yeah, I think an important thing to realize is that for people in honor-shame culture, whether believers or unbelievers, their primary identity and their sense of ethics is always going to be answered by this question of, what community am I a part of? In the West, we think of our religion or our Christian faith as my personal faith, or Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, which is, great. That can work well in a Western context. But in honor-shame cultures, they're much more collectivistic. And so they're going to view their faith as, what community am I a part of? Because that defines who I am and how I should behave. And so in terms of discipling people in an honor-shame context, I think one of the primary things that we need to emphasize is that following Jesus is not just a matter of changing someone's behavior, but changing their heart values. That is, what do they consider shameful and what do they consider honorable? And so are they letting the world define shame and honor in their own life, or are they letting God's standards, as revealed in Scripture, defining honor and shame in their life? And one of the concrete areas this gets played out in is the church. And so remember that honor and shame are essentially the evaluation of the group, of the community. They don't exist all by themselves. And so the church becomes the new honor-granting or honor-giving community that affirms people's true sense of honor that they have in God. And so the church, when it functions well as a community, confers honor to the things that are honorable in God's eyes, and they also shame the things that are shameful in God's eyes, or they reject or renounce the false sense of honor that the world might be tempting believers. And so the church functions as kind of the new community or the new conferrer of honor and shame. And that is how, as people participate in that sort of community, then their own notions of honor and shame, are transferred to the sinful, distorted cultural systems of honor, shame into a more biblical paradigm of honor and shame.
Well, very helpful introduction that we've had here, Jayson. I realize that we are just helping with an introduction. There's a lot more to understand and to be said. I want to encourage our listeners to consider Jayson's book. But Jayson, there may be other resources that you would recommend as well. You mentioned a workshop. Tell us just a little bit about those things, please.
Yeah, the best place to go is the website you mentioned at the top, honorshame.com. That is spelled the American way, not the British way, so HONOR, shame.com. And from there, there's lots of blog articles and links and videos and recommended books as well. So honorshame.com is the real gateway. I've written 2 books. The 3D Gospel is the short introduction, more for pre-field training. Then Ministering in Honor Shame Cultures is a longer book for people who are, more in full-time ministry. But then also, for those who are really interested in the topic, there is a conference next June 2017 at Wheaton College at a 3-day gathering about honor and shame in the gospel. And again, that's more information at honorshame.com.
Very good. We'll make sure that that is all in the show notes. If you're driving or riding your bicycle or whatever right now, don't worry, you can find that on the website. Jayson, if our learners would like to learn a bit more and follow up with a particular question, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, the best is probably the email info@honorshame.com.
There we have it. We want to thank you for spending this time with us and helping us to learn and sensitize us to this difference in cultures and how important and how valuable that could be to avoid some of the potholes, so to speak, that you may have learned from. We can maybe get around those through your work. So thanks so much for spending this time with us and sharing with our listeners today.
Of course, my pleasure.
Well, we hope you've been informed by this episode with Jayson and that we got your wheels turning along the way. Remember, if you've missed any of the links or resources that we mentioned, you can find them in the show notes on our website at globalmissionspodcast.com. And we invite you to participate in the conversation. You can reach us through the website with comments or on our Facebook page, as well as on Twitter. Your engagement through encouragement and suggestions is always welcomed. That's all for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International in Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. And please join us again in a couple of weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.